Go live, Mark. There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Fred Passman um, hosting this afternoon's Continental Commandery Naval Order National Naval History Virtual Lecture. And this afternoon, we have an exciting lecture scheduled. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to bring you up to date on some upcoming events. We're getting close to the National Congress, which will take place on the 22nd and 23rd of October. Watch your emails for notices about that. If you haven't yet registered for the virtual National Congress, I encourage you to do that. In preparation for that, we'll have our National History virtual Naval History Lecture, National History Day, excuse me, on the 23rd of September. And again, watch your emails for more information about that. Because we'll be having a Naval Order-wide National Lecture in September, and we've got the National Congress in October, our next Continental Commandery Naval History Lecture will be on the 18th of November, where we'll be, during which we'll be hearing presentation on the Battle of Midway, and that will be the first part of a two-part lecture. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Anthony D. Atwood. He's the Executive Director of the Miami Military Museum. Welcome aboard, Professor Atwood.
Hi, good afternoon, sir.
Professor Atwood is a retired Navy Chief Warrant Officer 3 with a doctorate from Florida International University. He is a native of Miami, and he saw service aboard the USS Dixon, AS 37, USS Conquest, MSO 488, and USS Bolster, ARS 38. He's a graduate of the Army Command and General Staff College Military History Instructor course, and he's taught extensively at the college level. And as I indicated, he also serves as resident military historian for FIU's Jack Gordon Institute for National Security. His dissertation was posted online. It was a history of World War II in Florida. It's had over 9,000 readers. We should be able to, sometime during today's program, send you a link to that site. He served during Desert Storm and Operation Noble Eagle. He helped build Camp X-Ray at Gitmo and served on the 2009 Presidential Inauguration Military Committee. He's a founding father of the Miami Military Museum, of which he's, as I mentioned, is the executive director, and he's presently writing a book. Professor Atwood, again, welcome aboard, and we look forward to hearing and watching your presentation this afternoon. I turn the deck and the con over to you.
I have the deck. I have the con. Thank you, everyone. Just by way of realities, my online dissertation, The History of World War II in Florida, now has is approaching 10,000 readership. So if there's any publishers or book agents out there, let me know, because that one's already done and is in the can and could be printed up easily, quickly, and profitably. So having said that, what I wanted to speak with you about concerns itself with local history and heritage, but it concerns itself with some events which had global ramifications. So what I want to talk about as a third generation Miamian is something that happened here in this region 60 years ago. So if we could, let's, Mark, if you would, let's look at Cold War in the tropics. 2 acts and a coda. We first want to talk about something that occurred 60 years ago, and the anniversary of that was hosted with great fanfare by the Brigadistas remaining, and they were all there with thousands, close to, well, about 500 for the actual talk, and they also included the sprinkling of Castroite hecklers, which you will always find at these sort of things. So anyhow, let's talk it, because our heritage here in Miami is really a tale of 2 cities. So let's talk about the Cold War in the tropics. The Bay of Pigs, April 15th through April 19th, 1961. Next slide. The Fidel Castro regime took power New Year's Day, 1959, when the present strongman of the island literally gave up and departed the country. And the forces opposed to him were a variegated cross-section of Cuban society, along with a great deal of sympathy and empathy from American counterparts here in the States, 90 miles away. It should be known that Fidel Castro visited the United States, raised money here in Miami, was interviewed on TV, spoke flawless English, which after the Bay of Pigs, he never spoke again. And he addressed crowds here and in New York, and he was at the time quite popular. Once he moved into power, along with a half a dozen other comandantes, things began to change. One by one, the other comandantes, Huber Matos was found to have anti-revolutionary documentation, and so he was invited to spend the next 30 years in solitary confinement. Another of the comandantes, Cienfuegos, was invited to meet with Fidel in Havana, and he did so, or he got on an airplane to do so, a Cessna. The airplane took off and exploded, and that was the end of Camilo Cienfuegos. William Morgan was, oddly enough, a Yankee from Ohio, who was also a commandante, and he was found to have anti-revolutionary literature in his belongings, and so he was invited to the wall and was shot by a firing squad. What amounted to was that the commandantes were either killed, the others, or they were close to Fidel, and therefore they lived. And the 2 who were closest to him were Raul, his younger brother, and Che Guevara. Along with shooting people, Fidel Castro also nationalized a great many of the industries, television, car sales, AT&T, all of that. And it became, for the United States administration of President Eisenhower, a real problem. So Eisenhower, who had planned the operation to remove Castro from office, Eisenhower had lots of experience in planning and executing invasions. It's what he did before he became president. So the original operation, which started with infiltration teams, was planned by President Eisenhower. It grew and it grew, as we'll see, and there were a couple of assumptions. One is that the people of the island would rise up against Castro at the first opportunity. Even with that assumption, President Eisenhower had reservations, and he wanted a Cuban exile government component to be part of this. So the Frente Revolucionario Democracia was created of prominent civilian exile leaders who were to go in with the invasion and proclaim Cuba to be a free country. With this plan laid and moving towards fruition, in April, President John F. Kennedy was elected in November and took office in January of 1961. Next slide. At the time, by then, there were over 1,500 in the exile communities had been recruited by the CIA. They had been flown down to Guatemala, and they were training at a mountain camp and an airstrip. The 45 Cuban aviators had been recruited to make up an exile air force of bombers and cargo planes, and over 80 Alabama Air National Guard pilots and technicians had been sheep dipped by the CIA and gone to train them in Nicaragua and Guatemala. The training was, it was an open secret that an invasion was coming. Castro knew it. If you look closely at the flyer, that was being handed out on the streets of Miami. So Fidel knew that an invasion was coming. Next slide. Okay, well, it's kind of hard to see the lettering for me, but the landing was originally to take place in daytime. That's an important consideration in military affairs, particularly with something as chancy as an invasion. It was scheduled to land at the town of Trinidad Casilda. Some people call it Casilda, some people call it Trinidad. It's one of those places like Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's a twin city on the south coast of Cuba. The city of Trinidad Casilda, or the twin city of Trinidad Casilda, had a harbor. It also had docks. It had equipment for unloading ships, which was something that would prove vital to the invasion. As you know from your lessons about D-Day, the mulberries and the planning, the idea of having a real port made a difference. So the next thing is that they would land at daytime, midday, and they would also be within 1 day's march of the mountains. So if things went wrong, they could retreat to the mountains, link up with the exile guerrillas who were already there, and carry on. What else Trinidad Casilda had was a population of about 30,000. That's 60,000 eyeballs, more or less, would be able to see them coming ashore, and they would also be able to see in the distance a United States Navy battle group, which was also a part of the plan, that the invasion force would be shadowed by the U.S. Navy. An invasion force consisting of the Essex aircraft carrier and 5 destroyers, and a submarine, were laid on. So those things were Eisenhower's plan. President Kennedy, when he took office in January, changed some of the components of that. One of the components was he changed the site. This is a site for an invasion where the invaders think they're going to be landing in a harbor and going ashore to a town of people. He changed it, next slide, to a place called the Bay of Pigs, Playa de Giron. The Bay of Pigs was a swamp. The Bay of Pigs had no harbor facilities whatsoever. The Bay of Pigs was 5 days march from the Escambray Mountains. And in order to keep secrecy so that people would not assume that the United States was involved, the time of the landing was changed to midnight. So on Saturday, the April 15th, as the invasion forces were shoving off from Nicaragua and Guatemala, the first airstrike by the exiles began. The 8 exile bombers, these were B-26s, antiquated, but they were quite useful during World War II. They were still in the inventory with the Alabama National Guard, so Air National Guard. So that's the aircraft that they were trained on. And there were a few old C-47s and the old Dumbo aircraft, cargo planes. So they attacked. Castro had 3 airfields, and they destroyed half of his aircraft on the ground. It was a surprise. He knew they were coming, but he didn't know when. Well, he found out that morning, on the morning of Saturday, April 15th. So the island went on red alert. Castro knew they were coming. And also he began arresting everyone he could, and putting thousands of people into stadiums and whatnot under guard. Then comes the fancy footwork of the decoy aircraft. There was a exile B-26 bomber that was disguised with markings as a Castro airplane. It was piloted by an exile anti-Castro pilot, and he flew it from Nicaragua to Miami International Airport. He then got out of the airplane and pretended to be a defector from Castro. This was to make a deception that Castro's own pilots were revolting. Well, Adlai Stevenson was to address the United Nations that afternoon. He believed this to be true, and in the lower picture you can see him. He's got big poster boards showing the aircraft and how the Castro pilots were defecting, and unfortunately there were newspaper and journalists there, and they looked closely at the photographs, and they pointed out that the aircraft had a steel nose cone, and that the nose cone of the Castro B-26s was plexiglass. What this meant was, and for not the first time, a Secretary of State has gone before the UN and come away from the experience with professional egg all over his face. Adlai Stevenson, who had been a presidential candidate twice, he was mortified that the CIA had worked this duplication and didn't check the nose cones, and above all, didn't tell him anything was happening. So he complained to the president bitterly and offered his resignation and a lot of that. Meantime, the invasion force is already at sea heading towards Cuba. Next slide. President Kennedy, after the mortifying affair at the UN, he called a halt to airstrikes. There was to have been a second strike by 16 bombers, and it was to take Castro's 3 airfields again. However, they were ordered not to pull chocks and make the mission. So that was to have dramatic consequences. That night, the invasion fleet of 7 ships carrying the brigade assembled off the Bay of Pigs. Next slide. The frogmen went in first around midnight, 1 o'clock, whatever it was. It was O Dark 100. These frogmen were led by CIA operatives who had been military officers before. At 3:15 in the morning, Fidel Castro got a phone call in Havana that something's going on. Some people have landed. He was shocked and amazed that they were landing at the Bay of Pigs, of all places. But nevertheless, he hopped in a car and drove to the battlefield as quickly as he could, while ordering his airplanes, which had been spared a second strike, to rendezvous over the beach at daylight. The brigade was landing. They hit some reefs, which had been looked at by spy aircraft and thought to have been seaweed. They were not seaweed, they were reefs, and some of the landing craft were taken out with the loss of radios. 175 exile paratroopers, led by a few Americans, landed at 7:30. So you've got a full-fledged invasion going on, and you've got also, next slide, the intervention of the vicissitudes of fate. Castro's aircraft, which still existed, arrived over the beach, and at 6:50, a lucky shot by a Castro aircraft with bombs and rockets took out the brigade's supply ship, the Houston. A few hours later, at 9:30, Castro airplanes sank the Rio Escondido. Now, these were airships that were in Bay of Pigs. They couldn't come all that close to the land because there was no harbor. There were no facilities. And both of those ships, the loss of both of those ships at the very beginning of the battle was to have real ramifications. By 4 p.m., Castro himself had reached the Bay of Pigs. Next slide. Okay, D+1, Tuesday morning, April 18th. If you look at the, I don't know if I can point it out to you, but if you look at the tank, there's tank in the upper corner of the slide. In the lower corner, there's some field pieces going off, but the tank, there's a fellow with a beret on who's standing up from inside the tank. That's Fidel Castro. He was many things, but he was many bad men are brave, and he was one of them. So using Russian tanks, Castro began attacking the beachhead. D+1, they fought all day, but the exiles were running low on ammunition. It's one of the things that happens when your supply ships are sunk. There were some airdrops by U.S. cargo planes from Opelika, which is an airfield in Miami. Old timers would refer to it as Naval Air Station. Miami. Now it's Coast Guard Air Station, Miami. The planes missed their mark. Bit by bit, the exiles were driven back to the beach. Because the area was so secluded, there was no chance to rally a civilian population to the support of the exile fighters, and there were no mountains to retreat to. One exile's daughter complained bitterly, and with reason, that her father had been a paratrooper and he jumped in and got hung up in a tree, and he hung from the tree for 3 days until he was arrested and seized by Castro soldiers going through the area. So there were some snafus to what happened. Next slide. So in the afternoon of the 18th, D+1, JFK allowed the Brigade Air Force to resume operations. Well, hallelujah. And they did. However, the element of surprise was gone. Castro's pilots fought refreshed, while the exile pilot, all they had to do was land in Cuba, have a sandwich, some Cuban coffee, and take off again. The exile pilots had a 5-hour flight from Nicaragua. Castro had also assembled all his anti-aircraft guns on site, and one by one, brigade aircraft were shot down. Now, some of the information we have on this is from the USS Essex and from its people who were literally eyewitnesses, or belay that. The destroyers came in close enough to see. The Essex, which had a very large complement of United States Marines on board, ready, willing, and able to go over the side to assist, they stayed over the horizon. They listened to the battle. Next slide. 4 of the American Alabama Air National Guard airmen, aviators, went into the battle. They did not have to, but they felt so strongly about it that Major Schamberger, Lieutenant Thomas Gray, Sergeant Wade Gray, and Sergeant Leo Baker flew 2 of these A-26s into the battle, and they were shot down. Both of these aircraft were shot down. Lieutenant Ray, and Schamberger and Gray were killed in the crash. Lieutenant Ray and Sergeant Baker parachuted to safety, or at least they parachuted and landed on the ground alive. Those 2 airmen were taken to Fidel, and against the Geneva Convention and military law, they were summarily exiled. They were shot in the head and killed. Next slide. So by the second day, D+2, they were running out of supplies. They're driven back to the beach, and Castro is closing in. They've got 105 killed, including those 4 Americans and a paratrooper named Eugene Herman Koch, and the KIA. Koch died of wounds later, and so that's a hush-hush thing that they don't talk about, and he's never gotten the credit or the reverence that he deserves. Without ammunition and no longer able to survive, all they could do was to surrender or try to escape. And the only way to escape is to swim. So that afternoon, the USS Eaton and the USS Murray came on shore and began exiling, picking up exile survivors. Next slide. 10 were shot after they had surrendered. 9 were suffocated when they were locked into a container truck. So many that, including the uncle of the former mayor of Miami-Dade County. That's how deeply this subject goes with the population here. And 10 tried to escape in a small boat, and that boat a week later washed ashore in Louisiana, and half of them were dead. 1,202 were captured, while across Cuba, thousands of exile supporters were rounded up. Many of them were shot, and Castro would remain in absolute power for the next 55 years. The reputation of John Kennedy, the United States, the CIA, and the exile community was all in tatters, and Castro was now a mortal enemy. Next slide. So the Frente Revolucionario Democracia, which Eisenhower championed, they were going to go and join the battle. They went to Opa-locka Airport, Reed Naval Air Station, Miami, and the reports, though, of what was going on were such that they just weren't put on a plane and sent there. They were instead put in a kind of a quarantine in one of the barracks, and they never were allowed to leave until after the battle was over. The exile community, which is an integral part of this South Florida, they were ransomed a year later for medical supplies. John Kennedy leaned into it. The exile community raised lots of money, and Castro needed everything from iodine to bulldozers, John Deere tractors. So they cut a deal, and the exiles were set free. They were ransomed in November of 1962. And the Castro regime has remained unchallenged ever since. Next slide. So U.S. military involvement, well, we had an aircraft carrier, and we had up to 7 destroyers. We had jets. We had state-of-the-art jets. And Castro had 20 propeller-driven aircraft. So had the U.S. forces been committed, there's little doubt of what the outcome would have been. Many Americans wished to join the battle. One skipper hung a sheet from his destroyer that our hearts are with you, but Big Boss says no. Anyhow, once the fighting begins, unplanned events such as the lucky sinking of the Houston and the El Escondido can happen. And Castro turned out to be a competent battle captain. Next slide. So the lessons learned: changing the site of an invasion can have dramatic effects. Geography matters. History is geography. Timing matters, whether you land in a swamp at midnight or you land in a harbor at noon. Those things matter. You can't stick with non-involvement once a battle starts. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, and this was crusty old Arleigh Burke. Arleigh Burke went to the president, and the president says, well, we don't want to appear as we're involved. And Arleigh Burke said, gee, did Mr. President, we're involved up to our eyeballs. Okay, anyhow, you shouldn't underestimate the enemy, and that military operations that are not pressed on to victory can lead to defeat easily enough. Next slide. So now we arrive at Act 2, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fidel Castro had every reason on earth to hate the United States. He knew well and good that had he been on the other side of the battle, had he been lost, he probably would have been stood up against a wall the way he had stood up many others. So as soon as he could, he wanted to get insurance that this would not occur again. And he got that insurance from the Soviet Union, the predecessor of the Russian Federation. He got that in the form of nuclear missiles. Next slide. Cuba and the Soviet Union formed an alliance. 40,000 Russian combat troops went to Cuba, along with thousands of intel operatives. There were United States missiles in place in Italy and Turkey that threatened Moscow. Premier Khrushchev proposed that if he stationed his nuclear missiles in Cuba, particularly given the showing of President Kennedy, the president, a year before, well, it could lead to good results for the Kremlin. Castro was eager to do this, and the deal also included some small nukes. These are tactical nukes, artillery shell nukes that can be used against ships or landing forces. Okay, so the Soviets began erecting missiles in Cuba. Next slide. These nuclear missiles were uncovered by two means. One, the United States had something called the U-2 spy plane. This was a CIA aircraft created by Skunk Works. It could fly way high and photograph what was ever down below with great precision. They also had human intelligence. There were still anti-Castro operatives who had not been discovered and killed in Cuba, and they backed up this information. They said, here are these guys who look blonde and Nordic, and they're talking what sounds like Russian, and they're going in convoys at night with these long trailers that are extremely long with what appear to be tubes in them. Okay, and they're setting up soccer fields. And Cubans have a passion for baseball. They don't play soccer. Anyhow, a Russian missile, if it had been launched from Cuba, would have hit Washington, D.C. in 13 minutes. And New York and Chicago were also in range. So this is a threat, an existential threat. Next slide. So there you see a photo, a map of the continent. You can see that they could have hit a lot of targets in continental United States. By September, the Soviets had deployed 40 surface-to-surface nuclear ICBM missiles, and they also had SAM, surface-to-air missiles, to protect them. This was no small problem. Next slide. And here's what they looked like. You can see the that's one of the sites, and you can see the trucks with their containers, and you can everything added up to setting up nuclear missiles. That's what the intelligence community reported to Kennedy, and that's indeed that it was further advanced than we even knew at the time. Next slide. So on the 17th of October, the president convened secretly the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council. The options were do nothing, use diplomatic pressure to remove the missiles, offer Castro a choice of splitting with the Russians or being invaded, a kind of a join us or not, or get invaded, real invasion. Or we could have brought forward a full force invasion of Cuba. I've talked with guys who were in the 82nd Airborne and they were ready to go. I've talked with people who were, it was a full-blown invasion of Cuba would have had some ramifications we'll look at, or we could have done airstrikes, airstrikes that always, it's one way to go with things. Or we could have blockaded the island. The military favored an invasion of Cuba. What they did not know was that Castro, or rather, belay that, the Russians had tactical nukes, which would have made havoc on an invasion fleet and an invasion beach. Kennedy rather, favored a blockade. Next slide. So on the 17th, Russian embassy officials, Kosygin and others, they brought him a personal message from Khrushchev, reassured him that under no circumstances would surface-to-surface missiles be sent to Cuba. Well, okay, maybe that's true in and of itself because the missiles were already there. Kennedy pretended he didn't know anything about all this. He was not aware that there were 40,000 Russian ground troops on the island, and he did not know that they had 130 smaller nuclear warheads. So you've got both sides, one side lying to the other side, and the other side is just in ignorance of half the equation anyway. Next slide. So on October the 22nd, President Kennedy suddenly surprised the Soviets by ordering the naval blockade of Cuba. That night, he went on television and made an address to everybody watching TV. He told the world the threat the United States was facing, that there were nukes on Cuba, and that it would not wash, that any attack on the Western Hemisphere would be considered an attack on the United States, and because of the Monroe Doctrine, and we would retaliate with full retaliation. He said that he was, at the present, we're just doing a blockade. If you look at the two photographs in the corner, one is, the lower one is the president as he's given this speech, working on it. The one above that shows a ship in harbor, and there's a silhouette. That's an American Navy fighter aircraft flying over it. So he went with blockade. Next slide. The blockade, the United States Navy ships began hailing ships from the Soviet Union in international waters and forcing them to turn back. This is casus belli among most folks. This is an act of war, but we were pretty close to it. All the U.S. forces went to DEFCON 3. We had around the world, we had aircraft circling in racetrack patterns, cutting donuts in the sky, 15 minutes from Soviet airspace. And the Soviet Union replied in kind. They ratcheted it up. Next slide. And of course, there was the near panic around the world. The business of hiding under your desk as these students, it stems from that event. Then civil defense, if you hide under your desk, you'll be safe from the nuclear blast. And people began building bomb shelters, and the world held its breath. Next slide. October 24th, came the Armageddon letter. All U.S. forces went to DEFCON 2, as did the Soviet forces, and the U.S. Navy is beginning to board and turn back civilian Soviet ships. We're talking about sailors and the officer of the deck with his sidearm, and sailors with their rifles going aboard these ships. And Ivan, I need to look under the tarpaulin. Yeah. Ivan, I need to look under the tarpaulin. Yeah. The pistol comes out, and things were approaching a very serious level. At that time, on the 26th, Castro wrote what's commonly known as the Armageddon letter, which is in which he urged the Soviet Union to go ahead and launch these missiles and destroy the imperialist Yankee state. Civilization faced destruction. Next line. Next slide, rather. And on the next day, it got so serious that Major Rudolph Anderson, United States Air Force pilot from McCoy Air Force Base in Orlando, Florida, took off on a U-2 mission, and a Russian commander who had launch authority fired a SAM, and it hit and killed him. And so, first blood. At sea, at that same time, the United States destroyers are dropping depth charges. Now, these are just splash bang depth charges, but they're designed to bring to the surface an enemy combatant. The Soviet Union had a protocol of 3 had to agree. That is the commander of the vessel, the XO, executive officer, and the chief of the boat. If they all agreed to launch, they had nuclear-tipped torpedoes, which could have caused havoc among the fleet and would have incidentally started a world war. So, unfortunately, 2 of the 3 on that Russian submarine underwater declined to agree to launch, and so they came to the surface. Next slide. Florida was ground zero. We can go over this ad nauseum, but during that time, 144 nuclear missiles were brought here. They were in 4 batteries in Everglades National Park, Key Largo, and a few other places. And of course, lots of SAM batteries. You can see some SAMs right there on the beach on the road to Key West. Next slide. It was all a little bit too much for both Castro and Kennedy. Khrushchev was deeply surprised at the American response, and he realized that this could get out of hand, and that let's make a deal. And so he proposed that the Russians withdraw their nuclear missiles from Cuba if the president would withdraw our nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy. The president saw closure and quickly agreed. And to defuse the crisis, Khrushchev sent a public radio message so there would be no understanding. The Soviet government agreed to cease work on these installations and to dismantle the weapons, crate them, and bring them home, and both sides stood down. A hotline was established so that such a thing could not happen again. Next slide. One of the legacies was that's the presidential bomb shelter on Peanut Island. Peanut Island is right off Palm Beach. It's a Coast Guard installation, and a bomb shelter was built there for the president. In November of the same year, and now we're looking at 60 years, the Russians, because they were so concerned about Fidel Castro and his proclivity to just push the button, that they secretly removed the smaller tactical weapons, and they did not tell Castro until they were gone. So the crisis was past. Next slide. There is a legacy to all of this, and we've only got a few minutes left, but Che Guevara, here's a picture of Che Guevara. Wonderful. This is our coda. He was dashing, idealistic, photogenic, brave, of course. Look at the picture. Next slide. That is the real Fidel, or the real Che Guevara. He was he just shot that poor soul in the head, gave him the coup de grace. And if you notice, the individual is handcuffed. He personally shot and killed quite a few people. Next slide. Ana Belén Montes. It's from a different lecture, but it's appropriate. She became the senior Cuban analyst for the DIA. And then it was discovered that she was a Castro agent, that she had been suborned and had joined the Castro ideology, and she's now in prison. But this was after faking us out for close to 40 years. Next slide. Kendall and Gwendolyn Myers. These two coneheads, this one had a PhD from Johns Hopkins, and they were both high-level people with the State Department. Imagine that. They were Castro people, and they gave... I got my phone turned off. Somebody called. He and his wife were charged with providing intel to the Cuban Directorate of Intelligence for over 30 years. And now they're in the brig. Next slide. Carlos and Elsa Alvarez. Get this. He was a tenured clinical psychologist at the university I work for. He and his wife worked there also. Well, guess what? They happened to be Fidelistas. And ironically, when they were first arrested, among those who went to speak in their behalf was the president of the university at that time. So you can imagine a little bit about, I mentioned there are hecklers, there are such people. There are Fidelistas in this town. Next slide. The Miami Five, the Cuban Five, those are Castroite agents who they infiltrated. They got close to a group called the Brothers to the Rescue, which would fly in aircraft over the Straits of Florida and point out when people were trying to escape the regime, and so that aid and comfort could be given to them. Well, they got close to Cuba, and the regime shot them down and killed them. And those five, you can see them. They're here in the picture, and they're with Fidel. After they served their time and got free, they went back to a hero's welcome. And Castro himself and there he is in his crusty jumpsuit. He welcomed them. So next slide. Castro and his directorate, there he is having a conversation. The guy's politely got his hands behind his back. Well, it's not so politely. His hands are tied, and that happened. It continues to happen. Next slide. The Cuban Comandantes, the original. There's Fidel. This one's dead. There's Che. There's Camilo. He's dead. There's the next one. He's dead. Uber Matos. There's the gringo, the Yankee Comandante. He's dead, and so is this other one. Final slide. So it's been 60 years. 60 años. Here's little Raulito with a sniper rifle out there, and doing his thing and for the revolution. And he is the last man standing. So, having been force-fed with a fire hose on the Cold War in the tropics, which goes on to this day, with the attacks on the embassy people, with the hearing loss and the equilibrium loss from goodness knows what. It's an ongoing story. But special thanks for this presentation go to Frederick J. Passman, Eric Bresnahan, and to Mark Wixom. So that concludes my talk. If there's any time for questions or any of that, have at it.
I want to thank you for that fascinating brief to the history of both the Bay of Pigs and then the blockade and tense times that followed with the Cuban Missile Crisis, Professor Atwood. You mentioned the Fidel Castro, and we have about 3 minutes. So there's a shopping list of questions, most of which we won't have a chance to get to. But when you mentioned that Fidel Castro wrote a letter on the 26th of October, right, 1961, right. I was wondering, given that we didn't have email back then, we barely had teletype back then. What was the fate of that letter, and how did we get a copy of that? Or is that a recording of maybe a phone call that he had?
Okay, well, we do have all those devices now. And all you have to do is Google the Armageddon letter, and you'll find it. The letter was published. The letter, remember now, since the 1880s, Cuba has been connected with underground cabling, underwater cabling, rather, to Florida. We first learned about the battleship Maine thanks to a telegram sent by the American consul in Havana, who said, did it, which meant the battleship Maine has just been blown up. So do it while we're chatting. Google the Armageddon letter.
Okay, I was just curious whether he sent that by snail mail or sent it as a telex. And he presumably sent it to the Kremlin, right? Or was that to the U.S.?
He sent it to the Kremlin, but at the same time, I know it's out there. I've Googled it. I've got a copy at the museum.
Okay. I'm going to take a look for that one.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, let's see. We're coming up on the half hour, and I don't want to hold up our audience. I do want to, again, thank you for the lecture. Look forward to hearing a variation on the same theme on October, is it the 22nd? We'll hear from you again. During
this is the 60th anniversary of these events.
Exactly on the 60th anniversary. So that'll be tremendous timing. And with that, I want to remind everybody again, join us in September for the September nationwide Naval History Lecture. Join us for the National Congress on the 22nd and 23rd of October. There's still plenty of time to register, but sooner is better than later. And with that, I want to wish everybody a great evening, or afternoon for those of you west of the eastern seaboard. And we'll go ahead and thank you all, end the broadcast.